The punch came from nowhere, crashing into Muhammad Ali's jaw just as ring announcer Johnny Addie was introducing him as the greatest of all time. 15,000 people in Madison Square Garden gasped in unified shock as Tony Russo, a journeyman heavyweight from Brooklyn, had just committed the most unsportsmanlike act in boxing history. But what nobody knew that night was that Tony Russo wasn't a villain. He was a desperate father fighting for his daughter's life in the only way he knew how. March 22nd, 1974. New York City's Madison Square Garden was buzzing with the electric energy that only a Muhammad Ali fight could generate. Ali, at the absolute peak of his powers, was scheduled to face Tony the Bull Russo in what everyone expected to be a routine tune-up fight before Ali's inevitable shot at regaining the heavyweight title. Tony Russo was exactly the kind of opponent promoters love to feed to rising stars. Tough enough to make the crowd feel like they were getting their money's worth, but not skilled enough to pose any real threat to the main attraction. At 31 years old, Russo had a record of 23-12-2, with most of his wins coming against other journeymen and club fighters. He'd never been ranked in the top 10, never fought for a title, never even been featured on television until this fight. What the boxing world didn't know was that Tony Russo wasn't fighting Muhammad Ali for glory, rankings, or even pride. He was fighting for something far more precious, his 8-year-old daughter Sophia's life. 3 months earlier, Sophia Russo had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The little girl who had been dancing around their small Brooklyn apartment just weeks before was now lying in a hospital bed at Memorial Sloan Kettering, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by chemotherapy and the terrifying reality of a disease that was stealing her childhood one day at a time. "Daddy, when are we going home?" Sophia had asked Tony during one of his daily visits, her small hand gripping his calloused boxer's fingers. "I miss my room. I miss my toys." Tony had forced a smile, fighting back tears that seemed to come easier these days. "Soon, sweetheart. Daddy's got a big fight coming up, and when I win, we'll have enough money to get you the best treatment in the world." But Tony Russo knew he wasn't going to win against Muhammad Ali. Nobody expected him to win. Hell, he didn't expect to win. The purse for losing to Ali was $15,000, more money than Tony had ever seen in his life, but not nearly enough to cover the experimental treatment that Sophia's doctors said might save her life. The treatment, available at a private clinic in Switzerland, cost $75,000. Tony's manager, Mickey Torino, had been honest about their financial reality. "Kid, even if you fight Ali 10 times, we ain't coming up with that kind of money. These insurance companies, they don't cover experimental stuff." That's when Tony had gotten the desperate idea that would make him infamous in boxing history. "Mickey," Tony had said 3 weeks before the fight, "what happens if I get disqualified? Do I still get paid?" Mickey had looked at him strangely. "Yeah, you get your purse. Win, lose, or disqualification. Why?" Tony had shrugged, but the wheels in his mind were already turning. If he was going to lose anyway, and losing meant watching his daughter die because he couldn't afford to save her, what was the difference between losing honorably and losing in a way that might create enough controversy to get him more fights, bigger purses, maybe even a shot at real money? The plan that formed in Tony's desperate mind was simple: create the biggest controversy in boxing history. Do something so outrageous, so unprecedented, that every promoter in the country would want a piece of the action. Become the villain that everyone wanted to see get beaten up. There was money in being hated, Tony reasoned, and he was willing to be hated if it meant Sophia could live. On the night of the fight, as Tony sat in his cramped dressing room in the bowels of Madison Square Garden, he stared at a photograph of Sophia that he'd taped to his locker. In the picture, she was blowing out the candles on her 7th birthday cake, her face radiant with the kind of pure joy that only children possess. That was before the diagnosis, before the hospital visits, before their world had been turned upside down. "You ready, kid?" Mickey asked, wrapping Tony's hands with methodical precision. Tony nodded, but inside he was terrifying. Not of getting hurt by Ali. He'd been hurt in rings across the country for over a decade. He was terrified of what he was about to do and what it might mean for his reputation, his career, and his soul. As they walked through the tunnel toward the ring, Tony could hear the crowd's anticipation building. Muhammad Ali fights were events, cultural moments that transcended sports. Tonight, Tony Russo was about to become part of boxing history in a way that nobody would ever forget. The Garden was electric as both fighters made their way to the ring. Ali, as always, was putting on a show, dancing up the steps, shadow boxing for the cameras, playing to the crowd that had paid to see a show as much as a fight. He was wearing his famous white robe with "The Greatest" embroidered across the back. Tony climbed through the ropes with none of Ali's flair. He was focused, grim, carrying the weight of his desperate plan and his daughter's life on his shoulders. In his corner, he noticed a small crowd of reporters and photographers, more media attention than he'd ever received in his entire career combined. Ring announcer Johnny Addie stepped to the center of the ring with his microphone, his voice booming through the Garden's sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Madison Square Garden for tonight's heavyweight bout." The crowd roared its approval. This was the moment Tony had been waiting for, the moment when everything would change forever. In the red corner, Addie announced, wearing white trunks, from Brooklyn, New York, with a record of 23 wins, 12 losses, and 2 draws, Tony the Bull Russo. A smattering of polite applause rippled through the arena. Tony raised his glove half-heartedly, his mind racing through what was about to happen. And in the blue corner, Addie continued, his voice rising with theatrical grandeur, wearing white trunks with black trim, from Louisville, Kentucky, the former heavyweight champion of the world, with a record of 44 wins, 2 losses, the one, the only, Muhammad Ali. The Garden exploded. 15,000 people rose to their feet, screaming, cheering, chanting, "Ali! Ali! Ali!" The noise was deafening, overwhelming, the kind of reception reserved for kings and legends. Muhammad Ali raised both gloves above his head, soaking in the adoration, spinning slowly to acknowledge every section of the crowd. He was in his element, the master showman at the peak of his powers. That's when Tony Russo made his move. As Ali turned to face the crowd on the far side of the ring, Tony took 3 quick steps forward and threw the hardest right hand of his life directly into Ali's unsuspecting jaw. The sound of the punch landing echoed through the Garden's sudden silence like a gunshot. Ali's head snapped to the side and he stumbled backward, more from surprise than damage. For a moment that felt like an eternity, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody could process what they had just witnessed. Then chaos erupted. The crowd's cheers turned to boos and screams of outrage. Security personnel rushed toward the ring from every direction. Ali's corner men jumped through the ropes, ready to tear Tony apart. Referee Arthur Mercante positioned himself between the two fighters, his face a mask of confusion and anger. But Muhammad Ali, after steadying himself against the ropes, did something that nobody expected. He held up his hand, stopping his cornermen from advancing on Tony. Instead of retaliation or rage, Ali's face showed something else entirely. Curiosity. "Why?" Ali asked Tony, loud enough for the ringside microphones to pick up. "Why did you do that?" Tony Russo, adrenaline coursing through his veins, found himself face to face with the man he had just sucker punched, and suddenly the words came tumbling out of him, like water from a broken dam. "My daughter," Tony said, his voice cracking with emotion. "She's dying, and I thought if I made you angry enough, if I created enough controversy, maybe people would pay to see you beat me up again. Maybe I could make enough money to save her." The Garden, which moments before had been a cauldron of outrage, began to quiet as Tony's words were picked up by the broadcast microphones and transmitted to living rooms across America. Johnny Addie, who had been announcing boxing matches for 23 years, found himself in the middle of the most extraordinary moment of his career. He would later say that hearing Tony Russo's desperate confession was like watching a man's soul break open in front of 15,000 people. Ali listened to Tony's explanation, and something shifted in the champion's famous brown eyes. The anger disappeared, replaced by something deeper and more complex. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of a pain that transcended the boxing ring. "What's your daughter's name?" Ali asked quietly. "Sophia," Tony replied, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "Sophia Russo. She's 8 years old and she's got leukemia, and the treatment she needs costs more money than I'll ever see in my whole life." Muhammad Ali was quiet for a long moment, the entire arena hanging on his response. Here was the most famous athlete in the world, the self-proclaimed greatest of all time, who had just been blindsided by a desperate father's sucker punch. Everyone expected retaliation, expected Ali to demand that Tony be banned from boxing forever. Instead, Ali did something that would be remembered as one of the most compassionate moments in sports history. He embraced Tony Russo right there in the center of the ring. The image of Muhammad Ali hugging the man who had just attacked him became one of the most iconic photographs in boxing history. It captured something that transcended sports, a moment when human compassion overcame competitive instinct, when understanding trumped revenge. "We ain't fighting tonight," Ali announced to the stunned crowd. "This man's got more important battles to fight than anything that can happen in this ring." But Ali wasn't finished. As security personnel and officials tried to figure out what to do with this unprecedented situation, Ali made an announcement that would change the Russo family's life forever. "I'm giving my purse to Tony Russo," Ali said into Johnny Addie's microphone. "All of it, every penny. And I'm going to make some phone calls tonight to make sure little Sophia gets the treatment she needs." The garden, which had been hostile to Tony just minutes before, erupted in applause. What had started as one of the most shocking acts in boxing history had become something entirely different. A moment of grace that reminded everyone watching why Muhammad Ali was beloved not just as a champion, but as a human being. Later that night, in a conference room at Madison Square Garden, Tony Russo sat across from Muhammad Ali and tried to process what had just happened. The chaos of the arena had given way to quiet conversation between two men who had just shared one of the strangest experiences in sports history. "Why?" Tony asked, the same question Ali had asked him in the ring. "Why would you help me after what I did?" Ali was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the wisdom that had made him more than just an athlete. "Man, I got everything. Money, fame, people, cheering my name everywhere I go. You got nothing except love for your daughter. That punch you threw at me? That wasn't about hurting Muhammad Ali. That was about saving Sophia Russo." I can respect that kind of desperation. True to his word, Ali not only gave Tony his entire $50,000 purse, but also used his connections to arrange for Sophia's treatment at the experimental clinic in Switzerland. More than that, he arranged for Tony to fight on the undercard of his next 3 fights, generating enough additional income to cover all of Sophia's medical expenses and secure her family's financial future. Sophia Russo's treatment was successful. The experimental therapy that her father had been willing to sacrifice his reputation to afford ultimately saved her life. She spent 6 months in Switzerland undergoing treatment, with her father by her side every day, both of them recipients of Muhammad Ali's extraordinary generosity. But the story doesn't end with Sophia's recovery, remarkable as that was. Tony Russo became a different man after that night at Madison Square Garden. The desperate father, who had been willing to become boxing's most infamous villain, discovered that he didn't need to be hated to make money. He just needed to be honest about his struggles. Promoters, inspired by the response to Tony's story, began booking him on cards across the country. Not as a villain, but as an inspiration. The working-class father who had been willing to sacrifice everything for his child and who had been saved by the compassion of a champion. Tony's career experienced an unexpected renaissance. He won his next 6 fights, not because he had suddenly become a better boxer, but because he was fighting with a different kind of purpose. He was no longer fighting just to survive. He was fighting to prove that second chances could lead to redemption. Johnny Addie, the ring announcer who had witnessed the most extraordinary moment of his career, became an advocate for boxer welfare. He used his platform to raise awareness about the financial struggles that many professional fighters faced and helped establish a fund to assist boxers with medical expenses for their families. "What happened between Ali and Tony Russo that night changed how I saw my job," Addie explained in a 1985 interview. "I wasn't just announcing fights anymore. I was witnessing human drama at its most raw and beautiful. That night taught me that behind every fighter is a story, and sometimes those stories are more important than the fights themselves." The photograph of Ali embracing Tony in the ring became one of the most reproduced sports images of the 1970s. It appeared on magazine covers, in newspaper editorials about sportsmanship, and eventually in the Smithsonian Institution as an example of sports power to reveal the best of human nature. Muhammad Ali never spoke publicly about his decision to help the Russo family, deflecting questions about his generosity with typical humor. Man, that wasn't generosity, that was self-defense. You think I wanted to get sucker punched again? But privately, those close to Ali knew that the encounter with Tony Russo had affected him deeply. It reminded him that his fame and fortune came with responsibilities that extended far beyond the boxing ring. Sophia Russo grew up to become a pediatric oncologist, dedicating her life to treating children with the same disease that had nearly claimed her life. In her office at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia hangs the famous photograph of Muhammad Ali embracing her father, along with a handwritten note from Ali. For Sophia, keep dancing. Love, Muhammad Ali. My father's desperate act that night saved my life twice, Dr. Sophia Russo explains to her young patients and their families. Once by getting me the treatment I needed, and once by showing me what it looks like when people choose compassion over revenge. Muhammad Ali taught my family that strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how willing you are to help when someone is hurting. Tony Russo fought professionally for 3 more years after that night at Madison Square Garden, compiling a record of 8-3 in his final 11 bouts, the best stretch of his career. He retired in 1977 and opened a boxing gym in Brooklyn, where he trained young fighters and told them the story of the night he punched Muhammad Ali. I tell every kid who walks through that door, Tony would say, gesturing to the framed photograph on his gym wall, that I became famous for throwing one punch. But the lesson ain't about the punch I threw. It's about how Muhammad Ali responded to it. That's the kind of champion you want to be. Not the guy who hits the hardest, but the guy who understands why someone else needs to hit in the first place. In 1995, Sophia Russo, now Dr. Russo, established the Ali Russo Foundation for Pediatric Cancer Research. The foundation, which has funded over $50 million in research grants, operates on a simple principle inspired by that night in 1974. Sometimes the most desperate acts come from the deepest love, and the most extraordinary responses come from the biggest hearts. Muhammad Ali attended the foundation's inaugural gala, where he was reunited with Tony and Sophia Russo for the first time since Sophia's treatment. By then, Ali's Parkinson's disease had begun to slow his speech, but his message was clear. That punch Tony threw at me 21 years ago started something beautiful. It showed the world that boxing isn't just about fighting, it's about family, it's about love, and it's about people helping people when they need it most. The fighter who attacked Muhammad Ali before the bell that March night in 1974 taught the world a lesson that transcended sports, that desperation can look like aggression, that love can drive people to desperate acts, and that true champions respond to both with understanding and compassion. Tony Russo threw the most infamous sucker punch in boxing history. Muhammad Ali responded with the most generous act of forgiveness in sports history. Together, they created a moment that reminded everyone watching that behind every fighter and behind every person is a story worth understanding, and that sometimes the greatest victories happen not when we fight back, but when we choose to help instead. The bell never rang that night at Madison Square Garden, but something far more important than a boxing match took place in that ring. A desperate father learned that he didn't have to become a villain to save his daughter, and the world learned that true greatness isn't measured by championships won, but by the compassion we show to those who are fighting battles we can't see. Tony Russo attacked Muhammad Ali before the bell. What happened next proved that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the most desperate acts, and that champions are defined not by their to retaliate, but by their wisdom to understand and their courage to forgive.